So, ma'am, we are now live. Respected guests, dear faculty, students, and cherished members of Brothers from the Periphery, it's with profound respect and heartful admiration that we welcome Professor Jyoti Puri to today's lecture hosted by Brothers from the Periphery. To introduce her is not simply to list achievements, it's honor a thinker whose intellectual legacy continues to shape the way we understand gender, sexuality, and nationhood, diaspora, and the intimate politics of life and death. Professor Puri, who holds the prestigious Hazel Dick Leonard Chair at Simmons University, is widely recognized as one of the most original and powerful voices in feminist and queer studies today. Her scholarly journey spans continuance and disciplines, always animated by the fierce commitment to justice and to those rendered invisible by dominant structures of power. Her first major work, Woman, Body, Desire in Post-Colonial India, remains a foundational text in feminist scholarship in and on South Asia. In this book, Professor Puri examines the way in which women's bodies and desire are policed by state apparatus and social ideologies in post-colonial India. What makes this work remarkable is its layered intersectional approach. It seamlessly moves between law, policy, nationalism, and popular culture, revealing how power operates in both spectacular and everyday ways. Her next monograph, Encountering Nationalism, is a concise yet intellectually rich engagement with how nationalism is gendered, racialized, and sexualized. Written with both scholarly perception and ideological clarity, this work has become a vital teaching tool and a reference point for students and educators across the globe. Here, Professor Puri invites readers to consider how the idea of the nation is intimately tied to the regulation of bodies, borders, and belongings. And now, through her current project, Waters of Passage, Death Rites in South Asian Diaspora, Professor Puri ventures into the sacred terrain of death, grief, and ritual. In this research, she asks urgent and intimate questions. And how do migrants mourn on the far soil of the call home? What becomes of the ancestral memory when death occurs in familiar lands? Through each of these profound contributions, Professor Puri has continually expanded the boundaries of feminist and post-colonial thought. Her scholarship is a map, one that charts the complicated, messy, beautiful terrain of human experiences. She writes not only the theoretical depth, but also with ethical clarity and poetic grace. And in doing so, she makes space for memory, vulnerability, and resistance, and for love. Today, as she shares with us her insights on Waters of Passage, Death Rites in South Asian Diaspora, we are not just hearing about rituals of death, we are being invited to think about life, about displacement, about what the fragile threads that bind us to our past and to another. On behalf of all of us at Voices from the Periphery, we extend the warmest and most respectful welcome to Professor Jyoti Puri. Her presence here is not just a privilege, it's a gift. Up to you, ma'am.
Ayush, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I appreciate it very much, and also a special round of thanks to Pallab for organizing all of this, for being the person who has been in touch with me. I'm delighted to be at an event hosted by Voices from the Periphery. I think you're all doing some really important work. So I'm happy to be here. I thought I would present a slice of my current project today, pivoting around the theme of Waters of Passage. I do want to take a couple minutes, or maybe 3 or 4 minutes, to actually locate myself in the body of work that I've done, and kind of give you a sense of the trajectory that has led me to my current project. And I do that keeping in mind that I believe many of you are interested in feminist or post-colonial, anti-colonial studies, cultural studies. And these are things that have been very formative for me. And I've been working with these fields for a while now. So in terms of locating my intellectual trajectory, I grew up in Mumbai and came to Boston for higher education, which is where I still am. And my graduate student years were incredibly formative. And my background is in sociology. It's my home discipline. And at the same time, what was deeply formative, influential in my intellectual trajectory were really two influences. One was feminist studies, and the other one was cultural studies. And what that meant was really from cultural studies being opened up to not only the significance of colonialism and empire, movement, migration, but also nationalism, critiques of nationalism, and forms of governance. And I think it allowed me also to understand myself as an immigrant, which back then was still a dirty word, and in the United States, and it is still today, which is deeply ironic for a nation that prides itself as a nation of immigrants, which is really a code word for settler colonialism. And to understand issues of sexuality and gender was incredibly important, especially from the lens of intersectional, transnational, and post-colonial feminisms. And really at that moment, post-colonialism as a field of study was really coming into its own. And increasingly, there were feminist voices that were intervening in this area. So it was a very formative time. And I remember reading Foucault's History of Sexuality and really sort of having my world rocked at the time. And I know all of this in many ways is now canonical, but at that moment, much of it was really contested. Foucault, for example, was deeply maligned in the US academia, sociology, did not even recognize him in many ways, but also other fields were quite dismissive. Post-colonial feminist voices, transnational feminist voices, women of color feminism, Gloria Anzaldúa and Sherry Moraga and others, that there was a lot of this sort of, they had to struggle to find to be able to be heard. And really, it's at this sort of, at these junctures that I started focusing on things that have really threads that are woven throughout my work at this point. And at one level, my work, in a way that Ayush was gesturing to, really is about the nexus of state and nation as understood through the lens of sexuality and gender. And my most recent book, Sexual States, which is about the decriminalization of the anti-sodomy law in India, it's a full-length study of it that really sort of exemplifies that. At the same time, and this is what I would say is the second strand, the transnational underpinnings of forms of governance influenced by histories of colonial rule, post-colonial legacies that we see unfolding, continuing to unfold in places in, where you are, where I am, is the second theme that is really shaping my writings. And the third theme has to do with the politics of knowledge production, that is decentering Eurocentric ways of knowing the world by foregrounding the global South. And I understand the global South not, really as a sort of narrowly as a geographic unit, but as a condition, as a social condition of marginality that can exist in a place like India, but also in the United States. And this is sort of the backdrop, the work that I had been doing. As I said, the last project was around the decriminalization of same-sex sexualities in India. And just as I was finishing the project, my attention turned back to a photograph that I had seen many years ago. And here I want to segue into my current project, and I would like to share my screen and share with you the photograph that inspired this project and also a few other slides. Okay, I think you are seeing this double, so let me try something else.
Ma'am, you just go the slides. Sure, yeah.
It's coming up. All right. So let's see. So this is the photograph that really started off this project. And research projects, I think, often have unexpected initiations. Even after many years, I still vividly recall the first time I came across this photograph depicting a Sikh cremation dating back to 1907 in Victoria, British Columbia. It was really the combination of image and text that first tightened my stomach in a way that is yet to release. 1907, funeral for first Sikh who died in Vancouver in 1907. No permission was granted by the Mayo or others. They took the deceased to a distant forest in the middle of the night and cremated the body in the morning. This is how it was captioned. I wondered, what was it like to die unexpectedly on foreign soil? How did fellow migrants cope with the loss? What did it mean to be denied permission for the last rites, to cremate the body furtively in the wilderness, and to mourn at the limits of the social? So a friend of mine had first shown this photograph to me many, many years ago, and it had sort of come in and out of my memory. But as I was alluding to earlier, finishing up the last project, this sort of photograph kind of pulled my attention, and I returned to it. While I couldn't imagine it as a research project at first, the image and its sociological implications stayed with me. I was acutely aware of the exclusionary undertones of the image text, as well as the ways that race and gender were playing into the presence of Sikh men, a photographer, and white observers on the right side of the frame. So, here is sort of where, and possibly a photographer here. A reporter here, and of course there's a photographer behind the camera. Further research into the image revealed a more complex story, as research often does, but also a disconcerting detail. The photograph circulated as a postcard, prompting questions about the affects and desires motivating white settlers to consume the deaths of others. So as you can see, this is going to a Miss Lucy Cousin in Victoria. And so this is the backside, the other side of that photograph. Fast forward to 2019, just prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, I find myself in the office of Imam Feni at a mosque in the Boston area, asking him about the denied petition for an Islamic cemetery in Walpole, Massachusetts. I'm interviewing him about how town officials initially let Al Marhama, a Boston-based Islamic burial service, apply for the necessary permits only to reverse course due to the fierce prejudicial opposition from local residents. Imam Feni, his voice wavering, responds, "It was very disheartening, very sad." This case is but one instance in a recurring pattern across Canada and the United States, where attempts by Muslim communities to establish autonomous cemeteries are met with vehement resistance. The struggle to funeralize the dead among racially and religiously marginalized communities, it turns out, is still unfolding more than 100 years later. In this project, I focus on funerary and mourning practices among Sikh and Muslim South Asian immigrants who journeyed from colonial India to North America. While their lives have received scholarly attention, their deaths and death rites remain underexplored. Thus, taking a broad historical view from the early 20th century to the present, I am studying Sikh cremations and Muslim burials in North America. This investigation has meant delving into archival materials from travel literatures and historical newspapers to traces left by migrant communities. These sources are essential to piecing together the migrant funerals, conditions under which they occurred, or how they were even rendered into postcards. I combine these archival materials with contemporary fieldwork among Sikh and Muslim communities in the US and Canada, which includes visits to gurdwaras and mosques, interviews with religious leaders and lay members of Sikh and Muslim communities, meetings with funeral directors serving migrant groups, and trips to Muslim cemeteries and crematoria in Massachusetts, California, Texas, British Columbia, and Ontario. Much like establishing a life, death is integral to migration. Here are just some reminders as if we need them, but, and the one that you're seeing here, migrant deaths in Asia hit record high in 2024, right? As news headlines demonstrate, migrants lose their lives during arduous journeys involving treacherous crossings over land and water. More routinely, loss raises practical issues of how to funeralize and mourn, matters that cannot be taken for granted when migrants' religious and cultural practices diverge from state provisions for handling bodies. For example, open higher cremations, burials interning, shrouded bodies angled to face the Kaaba, or specific guidelines for how bodies are to be prepared for the final step. So typically in the US or Canada, if not typically, frequently, bodies are embalmed and sort of presented for viewing before they are buried, and they tend to be, except for the viewing part, the rest of it tends to be very private. And they are also, the bodies are buried typically in coffins, and depending on the amount of money people would like to spend for the funeral, the coffins can be quite elaborate. And when you think about it in terms of from Muslim perspectives or the Islamic guidelines, that bodies are expected to be simply shrouded and lowered into the earth, positioned in a particular way, without there being any embalming, without there being any liners, sort of lining the grave, or even a coffin. Seen from perspective of South Asian migrants, death foregrounds social, political, and affective concerns, enduring patterns of racial exclusion, religious strife, and contested belonging to the nation. The meticulous care that migrants and diasporics bestow on the deceased as they invent and adapt religious and cultural rites in the face of social and legal constraints is equally pivotal to stitching together the story of loss. Archival records offer glimpses into how migrants gathered around the corpse, pooled resources to cover funeral expenses, observed customary and inventive funeral practices, and mourned collectively. I want to share this fragment with you. This is, a record keeping for a collection that was raised for a funeral, and this is back in 1913. So, there aren't very many, but if you can see, there's $2, $5, $1, like that sort of being listed here, and there are names of people. So there's this sort of really careful, meticulous record keeping that is going on. We don't have very many such fragments left, and this is one of the few that I was able to find. Managing death remains central within Muslim and Sikh communities, where religious leaders guide followers on doctrine, legal issues, and coping with racial backlash. Gender plays a significant role in this story, as early South Asian immigrants were overwhelmingly male, but women and girls did migrate in small numbers. Take, for example, the story of a teenage street performer, Ala Bandi. So it's not really, her name is written as Alabundi in news reports. And it's not really clear whether, and it's been spelled in various ways. So her name, the exact spelling or what her name was, is a little bit unclear. It remains somewhat enigmatic. So, a teenage street performer, Alabandi, whose wake was concocted in a New York based tabloid in 1881
এর মডার্নে ঢুকবে না পোস্ট মডার্নে
and asked to be read against the archival grain. So, this was a group of
মডার্নে
street performers that were invited by a organizer in New York, and this was that they would, he had this play and they were supposed to be part of it. But he didn't think that the style, once they got here to New York, the styles, he wasn't sure about it. It didn't land very well among the audiences, and so there was a lot of
শিক্ষণ না থাকলে আমি সালা ওরিয়েন্ট
really
ইলেকশন
problematic
চিনতামই না
response. But unfortunately, in the midst of all of this, the whole issue was compounded by the fact that she passed away, and she was young. She was, 16 perhaps. And so this tabloid is basically, kind of projecting, it's making this up. And if you can see the ways in which, the sort of the raised hands, how people are dressed, and a shrouded body that is in the midst of it. While death helped forge community among the early migrants, once the number of South Asian women swelled over the 20th century, they became central to dealing with the end of life. Furthermore, contemporary accounts of unexpected intimacy that emerge among women and among men who volunteer to perform Sikh and Islamic rites of washing and shrouding bodies are eye-opening. In the volume Loss, queer theorists David Eng and David Kanzanjian center mourning as that which remains of lost histories as well as histories of loss. When viewed through the lens of South Asian immigrants, constructing lost histories and histories of loss involves tracing transnational dislocations across more than one empire and grappling with national states conditioned by settler colonialism, enslavement, and the pervasive force of anti-immigrant nativism. It means tracking intersectional histories into the present, shaped by the consequences of September 11, 2001, surges in anti-immigrant racism, which we are seeing played out on a daily basis here in the US in particular, as well as the slow drip of death due to systemic violence and neglect of Black, Indigenous, trans, and gender-expansive groups and communities. Placing the project within these ongoing histories reveals the complexities of social and political life in North America, where death for many is not segregated nor sequestered, but a matter of direct concern. And here I'm responding to these very long-standing debates and approaches in sociology, its subfield, which is called the sociology of death. And it's interdisciplinary. It's really influenced also by medical sociology and psychologists and other people who are really interested in end-of-life issues. And in this field of death and dying, two of the debates that are really, or two of the approaches, sometimes it's debated and sometimes not, but one of it is that death is a taboo in Western contexts, such as the United States and Canada, and that the other is that death is sequestered in the sense that it is handled by professionals, a funeral industry, and it's managed by hospitals, and then there are people who will sort of transport the body and bury it, so that people don't really anymore, as a result of modernity, don't really have direct contact with the dead. And if you look at it from the angle of immigrants, South Asian immigrants, Sikh and Muslims, both historically, but even today, Death is neither sequestered, people are very hands-on with it, and death is not taboo. And this is also true for other Black and Brown immigrant communities in the United States and African Americans and indigenous groups here. That to say that death is a taboo is really a privilege, I think, for middle and upper class communities and also people who are predominantly white. So that very specific experience in death and dying gets extrapolated to everybody, that this is the Western or the American way of death. And looking at it from the lens of immigrant communities, you really sort of you see the disconnect with that, and there is need and room to press against those kinds of dominant narratives. The research adds up to an analysis of death as a site not only of personal loss and grief, but also as a site of social inequality, exclusion, and contestation. It underscores death as a social as well as political, national, and geopolitical concern. The project relates to other studies of colonialism, nation, race, religion, gender, and sexuality, while adding to the significance of death and its rights. By exploring immigrants' ability to cremate historically or bury in the present, the analysis links with sociological and critical studies of racial and religious exclusion. It connects to migration studies by addressing the relationship between death rights, placemaking, and migrant life worlds. I seek to narrate loss among Muslim and Sikh immigrants while challenging enduring misconceptions of South Asians as fundamentally unmodern by emphasizing their pragmatism, inventiveness, and creativity. Take, for example, how Muslim spokespersons strive to uphold the dignity for the deceased by confronting racisms, making reasoned arguments, and taking conciliatory positions in their efforts to establish Islamic cemeteries. So a number of these cases have gone to state courts, the highest courts within each of these states, and typically the judges will rule on behalf of the Muslim communities because what they are asking for is neither unreasonable, but in fact, nor is it something that they are not entitled to, right? Because, I mean, that ability to be able to consecrate the dead in a way that is, aligns with your own guidelines, as long as it is within the broader parameters of law, that is acceptable for any community. Jewish communities, for example, have long had their own burial grounds. And so the question becomes really, why are local communities, residents oftentimes, but in some cases even officials, town governance, municipal authorities are really making it very difficult for Muslim groups to be able to establish their own burial grounds. And so typically when these cases end up in the courts, they do get relief from courts, but the point is that they have to go through the process. In other cases, they will press back or make accommodations. So my point over here is that there's a huge range of responses, but that what is driving here is a sense of pragmatism, a sense of creativity, that the immigrant group, Sikhs and Muslims, are, they're flexible. And the point that I'm making in this project is that they're drawing from their religious and their theological sources, and that sense of creativity and pragmatism is really coming from there. And in that sense, religion is being lived and interpreted in these creative ways. Additionally, I strive to etch a sociology of loss and life, joining scholars like Nina Jacobi in this effort. This approach spans the death of humans, non-human species, and the environment, weaving together the material and affective deprivations related to people, land, and futures. It considers environmental aspects and the sustainability of crematory and burial practices in Sikh and Muslim diasporas. The analysis draws inspiration from intellectual lineages of Black, queer, and trans, indigenous, and critical feminist studies that have given us a constellation of concepts. And if you look at it, these are, queer, trans, African American scholars, critical race scholars, right? You get this sort of, and there are all of these and other concepts that really help propel this work forward. Such a sociological and interdisciplinary approach sets the stage for recognizing the many lives of death, spanning personal, collective, national, and planetary dimensions. This approach allows us to pivot from viewing death, grief, and mourning as social constructs to understanding death and mourning as widespread social and cultural conditions. This breadth emphasizes death as a site of lived religious, social, and cultural practices, but also as a site of dominant representations and a way of encountering others. Death can be a way of misunderstanding and characterizing civilizations while potentially denigrating the people. So I want to stop here for just a moment and check in with you to see how you are all doing. I have another, one sort of slice of this, but I will share it with you. I can talk it through. I'll share it with you if we have time. So let's, can I, Ayush, can I just check in with you to see if this is a good time to stop and take some questions before proceeding, or to continue? What would be your recommendation?
Ma'am, we can proceed on 10 minutes, I think. Then we will start the question answer.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Okay, so what I want to do in the remainder of this presentation is actually take you to an early period. And this is, we hear a lot about, and I focus in this project about immigrants coming to North American soil. But what I also want to share with you in this brief presentation is what happened when North Americans, so US-based and Canada-based travelers, and in some cases these were people who were really elites, traveled to South Asia, to colonial India, sometime after, through the second half of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And the ways in which they responded to death waves, and in fact, a lot has been written about travel literatures. Lots of people have actually mined them for all kinds of insights. What I was surprised to find was, in fact, that when people in these travel genres, when people traveled, they systematically addressed how others managed death, what the death rites of these places looked like, that was part of the genre of travel writing. And so I went back to, I sort of collated a lot of these texts and, analyzed them for how they were really depicting death among people in colonial India. And because perhaps the Muslim burials were seen as not that different or unique or exotic to the eyes of these mostly Christian travel writers, what really then captures the imagination is cremation. And one more thing about this is, at the time, by the 1880s, and after cremation, the debates around cremation versus burial were very active in the United States and then also Canada. And so there's a lot of attention to try to figure out what is better, whether it's cremation or burial. So this is the backdrop against which all of this is happening. These are elite travelers arriving by ship, crossing the waters and the ocean, arriving by ship to India as a destination or just sort of passing through. And this is what they have to say. In the remainder of this presentation, I would like to focus on these dominant portrayals of migrant death and mourning rites, often referred to as deathways. So the question really is, what did white settler groups know about foreign or quote unquote Eastern deathways before and as South Asian migrants began trickling into North America at the close of the 19th century? It turns out that middle and upper class publics knew a fair amount about others' death practices. Apparently, Westerners have long been interested in the question, how do they bury their dead? As a window to other societies, even though burial is not a universal practice, so it's being used as a metaphor for how others manage death. So I'm just looking at, so as a genre, travel literatures documented Eastern deathways depicting practices such as cremation, Islamic burial, carrion feeding as is practiced by Parsis, and funerary architectures such as graves, mausolea, and tombs. While the authors are almost all white males with different political and ideological orientations, these differences fade in their reporting on Eastern deathways. Rather, the depictions converge around the imperatives of empire, nation, race, gender, and sexuality. And so let me just give you a couple of quick, why is this, all right. So here is William Henry Sword. This is Travels Around the World, 1873, and this is what he has to say. What was our surprise to find that fires, which had supposed for a temporary illumination, were funeral fires. Ghats are built on the banks for the sole purpose of cremation. The spectacle turned our thoughts for the moment upon the strange process of disposing of the remains. So this is, sort of fairly typical as people are traveling. And what happens is, and this particular quote illustrates that. So they're in Benares and they're, sort of wafting down the river and they see all of these ghats. And clearly he is unsettled by it. But then they go to a place like Bombay and then they go to another cremation ground, right? And so my point is that they are both upset by this, but at the same time, they're seeking out these places. And this is very typical. So they're commenting on cremation ghats. They're going to a Parsi Tower of Silence. It's really part of this sort of sightseeing tour that so many of these writers are going through. Mark Twain is another person, and I probably don't have the time to share that, but we can talk about that in Q&A. Jackie Kennedy, JF Kennedy's wife, when she goes to India in the 1960s, she's going to Banaras and going, right down the river and looking at these cremation ghats too. So it's sort of it becomes part of encountering India, right? Both colonial India as well as post-independence India. This is another one, Bayard Taylor, and this is really about travels to Egypt. And if you think about Egypt in that way, what becomes very clear is that, all of these pyramids and tombs that are so central to the North American imagination about Egypt are really commentaries on death, right? That these are places where the dead lie. And so that's the primary way of engaging a place like Egypt. Here's another one, My Winter on the Nile, Charles Warner talking about mummies and Muslims, right? I'll just let you quickly glance through it. And this is Robert Minturn, who is entering via Calcutta, 1858. And, this kind of narrative about bodies floating down the Hooghly River, you see that in more than one. It's, almost scripted. Like the responses are the same. These are etchings. And if you can see, there's a child there. Just this gruesome and this one is just wanted to make sure I give you the right date on this. The engraving is Hindu mother lamenting the death of her child, right? And sort of you see the orientalized depiction here, the bare breasts, right? And here's the text. That there's something so deeply irrational about Hindu mothers that they will throw their children into the Ganga. But I want to end with this particular one, My Great Wide Beautiful World by Hunita Harrison. And I want to do that by just to make the point that there were other ways in which, death can be a means of encountering a place like colonial India or Egypt or any of the other places that are covered in these kinds of travel genres. And this one, Juanita Harrison's, it comes out in 1939, so there's a long span here. But it stands out for a few reasons. One is that she is an African-American woman from a working class background and who is writing and traveling in a different way than the white elite travelers or travel writers. And she is actually working her way through this. So she doesn't have the means to be able to simply, take this expensive around the world trip. So she's actually working her way through it. And it gives her a very different way of encountering these places. And she also has limited formal education. And so she writes not as a critic or a professional travel writer, but really as a person encountering a diverse world. And she's in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and she attends the funeral of a rich person. And she describes her funerals and takes an open viewpoint and, is sort of talking about the intimacies of life and mortality. And, as she's describing all of this, she's talking about, she's at this place where the funeral is going on, the cremation is going on, and she's describing this sort of erotic encounter with this other person at the same time. And so there's something really wonderful about this kind of weaving in of both death and eros and, in fact, life. And this is the last thing that I want to end with, where she's talking about really Dalits here, and there was no roughness and seemed to be of the kindest kind, right? Like, so in that sense, she's really, what I think she exemplifies is that conditions of empire may enable travel, but it is possible to write in a way that doesn't take on all of the burdens and the legacies of empire, the ideologies of empire. And she focuses on her encounters with locals, showcasing her openness and interest in the people she meets. So just all to say, another life of migrant death is and was and is indeed possible. Okay, let me stop there.
So thank you so much, ma'am, for the deeply moving and intellectually rich lecture. Your words have offered us not only the critical insights into the rituals of death and memory in the diaspora, but also profound reflection on the migration, mourning, and the emotional geographies of belonging. You have helped us to think about how bodies grieve and the histories travel, and what it means to carry ancestral memory across unfamiliar shores. We are incredibly grateful for the generosity of your thoughts, and now, with your permission, we would like to open the floor for questions and reflections. We welcome our audience to join the conversation, whether their thoughts, questions, or response to what we have just heard. And those who have joined in our online meet, they can also unmute themselves and ask question to direct professor. Otherwise, we will take some questions from our YouTube. So, ma'am, can we first take some questions from our YouTube?
That sounds really good. I'm sort of eager to hear from you all and hear your thoughts. And I really invite you to share your questions or even just your thoughts, right? Like the one nice thing about a format like, this sort of Google video is that it allows us to also have a conversation.
So we have our first question in YouTube. It's asked by Arnav. He's asking that in your exploration of death rites within the South Asian diaspora, how do you theorize the relationship between ritualized mourning and the post-colonial condition of displacement? Drawing from thinkers like Said Homi Bhabha, could you think of these mourning practices as forms of post-colonial hybridity, where grief becomes a site of negotiation between ancestral memory and diasporic ritualization? In such a liminal space, how do death rituals resist or reproduce the nation form and symbolic violence of cultural purity?
I thank you so much, Arnav. I think that's a really good and correct, rightly so, a layered question. And in some ways, all of this, the sort of the post-colonial condition, questions of hybridity, certainly inform my thinking. Um, and and not only the post-colonial, but a kind of anti-colonial impulse also. So it informs my thinking. At the same time, I think what we haven't done as well in terms of post-colonial theorizing, post-colonial literatures, is really think about this complex role of religion, right? And particularly in terms of the context of immigration or migration. And I know in the context, in the Indian context or South Asian context, really, that questions of religion are primary, and we see the sort of dangerous aspects and their, really their material threats kind of playing out on a daily basis. But in terms of questions of hybridity and diaspora, I feel like we haven't done as good a job in terms of thinking about religion as it is lived and interpreted, right? And that sort of that to the very theological foundations of these sort of, of these frameworks. So that's sort of one piece. The other piece, I think, has to do with thinking about ritual, not just as something that people do, something that is prescribed, but ritual in the sense of doing. And just when we think about doing, right, the practice, the iterative aspects of doing, what it means to take care of the dead, it opens up a whole sort of, connected terrain of sensing and feeling, because it's also not just the emotional, the aspects around mourning, it's also the senses, the sensorials in terms of the touch and the feel of something, right? So all of that is happening, and it is exhorting us, I think, toward really kind of complicating our epistemological frameworks for how we understand all of this. And so that's that's the sort of the piece that I think is important here to do justice. And the last thing I will say is that, one also has to be careful to not romanticize religion, right? And particularly even in the diaspora, we see again its sort of its dangerous aspects that play out, whether it's in terms of Hinduism or even Sikhism. Sikhism abjures caste, yes, but the reality is the caste system is playing out even in the diaspora, right? And so one has to take that into account. But, and here's the thing, there are these sort of glimpses, and that death allows those glimpses to see where, in some cases, under some conditions, and I think that's sort of specific to the death rights, there is all of that. My point is, it just calls for a much more complex framework.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we will take another question. It's asked by Rakhi. She's asking that you mentioned the philosophy of death. How do you think about death not just an event but as a social relation? In your view, what can death teach us about the way we live, particularly in relation to exile, migration, and the idea of, in quote, home? Can death ever be a form of return, resistance, or even belonging in the context of diaspora?
Raki, I so appreciate that question. It's very close to my heart. And, in many ways, the question of migration and immigration are questions about the crossing of political borders, but they're also about the crossing of oceans, right? In that sense, water is, we are so used to in our world when we think about the sort of the global map, divided land into all of these territories, and then there are international waters. But I think water is really a reminder in many ways of the fact that nature in that sense, and I don't mean it in any romanticized sense, nature itself is a social construction, but water becomes a reminder of how porous our political borders are. And so when I think about it in that sense, and think about death, as you're saying, as a social relationship, I think what it reminds us is, and if you sort of if you track the process, the preparation of the body into its final consecration, whether it's to heat in a crematory or to the ground, it really raises a question about, like, why do we wash bodies that are going to go into the ground, or bodies that are actually going to be consumed entirely by fire or by heat? And so that question of the social relationship that death shows is not just to bodies, but also to water, right? Like, it's asking us to think about all of that. And then when, and this is particularly pertinent for Sikhs, when, according to Sikhism, it is recommended, ideally, that the remains, the cremated remains, the ashes should be immersed in a flowing body of water. And I think, to me, that is such an important reminder that when we think about belonging, that it's the question over here, I think, that immigrant death is really showing us, or what it is pointing to, is that the issue of belonging that we so frequently tie to the nation state is in fact a deeply limited way, a deeply narrow way of thinking about it. And what death rights are showing us over and over again is the significance of belonging to a broader environment that cannot be contained by boundaries. And so, belonging to water, or for Muslims, this lowering of the body into the earth, that eventually what they are asking for, what Muslims are asking for in the United States or Canada, is that ability to belong where the death has occurred. And that is as much to the nation as it is to the earth, to the soil. And so this is forcing us to not only identify different kinds of relationships that death illuminates, but also to think through their implications.
So thank you, ma'am. We will take two more questions, just racialization and bureaucratic violence. And how do you theorize the afterlife of those lives within the administrative, legal, and emotional terrains of the host state? In your research on death rights among South Asian immigrants, how do you understand the conflict between the state governance of the dead through burial laws, death certificates, and in quote acceptable mourning and diasporic communities' attempts to assert ritual sovereignty?
Yes. Again, such an important and a rich question. In terms of the afterlives, I think that is precisely where the struggle is, and that struggle to memorialize and remember in ways. Let me sort of back up a little bit here. That on the one hand, as you're pointing to in your question, we have this sort of terrain of social and legal constraints that are operating, right? That are shaping what is possible and what is not possible. At the same time, you have diasporic communities that are trying to work within that kind of constraint. But I think and here's the sort of point that I think is important, what diasporic groups, immigrant groups are been able to do is to go beyond just that sort of point of tension. Because in some ways, to simply think about it as tension or contestation implies that people are constrained by it, right? Like, so whatever the dominant constraints are, we are simply responding to that. And I think looking at it from the vantage point of death is really reminding us. And here is where the afterlife, preserving that afterlife, building what I call social worlds around death that exist either through volunteer work, Asian not-for-profit crematoria in a place like British Columbia, through establishing autonomous Muslim cemeteries. What in fact people are doing is trying to ensure the afterlives of people who have been, whose lives have been precarious or who've been marginalized in one way or another. And that process of remembrance and ancestor making becomes absolutely crucial through death. And the last thing I will say about this that is important is it's not about, when we think about ancestor making, we think about it in a kind of, in the sense of kinship, right? The sort of narrowly understood related question of kinship by marriage or by birth. What is happening here in the diaspora is a kind of collective ancestor making. And so this is about the afterlives of all people, people who are part of the faith, all Muslims or all Sikhs who are, it's about that ancestor making. And I'm neither Muslim nor Sikh. And for me, this becomes the political project, right? Is that the project is in fact about the afterlives of people in the diaspora that I think, they are our ancestors, whether we are narrowly of one faith or another. It's about this process of ancestor making that I think we should do collectively. And I think that'll go a long way in terms of shifting also our, narrow parochial politics.
Thank you, ma'am. We will take one last question, though we have so many questions there. Because the time constraints, we have to take only one. I'm just randomly pick up this question. It's asked by Yali Boirako. She's asking that how do you, as a feminist sociologist, grapple with the problem of translation, not just linguistic, but ontological and political, when engaging with one world are rendered visible in another, be it through academia, policy, or diaspora identity politics, what gets lost, distorted, or sanitized?
I mean, I think that's a beautiful question, and I think that's in some ways all of us who write, certainly in the United States, but not necessarily just who write in the United States, who write in English as our primary language. That these are questions that are so deeply relevant to us, and I think in some ways it's not a question that needs to be answered so much as a question that we need to sit with and grapple continually at every stage of the project, whatever the project that one is working on. I do think, though, and I won't go into all of the details about sort of epistemological frames that are so deeply and profoundly Eurocentric in a way that sort of becomes, the question becomes, how do we disentangle ourselves from it, as if we can simply disentangle ourselves from it. So the question really becomes of how do we live, how do we expand these Eurocentric frameworks that are also part of our inheritance. And by our inheritance, I mean sort of a place like India, right? Like that this was part of our inheritance. But also that, that is not our only inheritance. And I think one sort of way in which I can sort of give you a glimpse of how I'm thinking about it is to think and begin this project in the prologue with my own reflections about death. As a child growing up in Mumbai, reading Hindi, but primarily English, the Amar Chitra Kathas were my first engagement with death. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Satyavan and Savitri's story, right? And that was, and the sense of death as a liminal condition, not as something that is done, not as a cessation of time, but something that's different of my inheritance. At the same time, it's deeply Brahmanical, colorist, upper caste, this problem that is, that is kind of reflected or captured in the Amarchitra Kathas, that is also something that I have to contend with. So I hope that sort of gives you a sense of how I'm thinking about it as opposed to how I'm answering the question.
So, thank you, ma'am. As we come to the close to the meaningful gathering, I want to extend our deepest gratitude to you, Professor Puri, for being with us today. Your lecture has not only illuminated the complex question of diaspora, death, and ritual, but also reminded us of the ethical power of listening, remembering, and writing with care. You have shown us how mourning is not only personal but profoundly political, how memory, when shaped by migration and loss, becomes from resistance, community, and healing. We will truly honored to have you here, not just a scholar, but as a thinker who speaks with empathy, clarity, and quiet strength. Thank you for challenging us, for moving us, and for opening up new directions of thought and for dialogue. To our audiences, thank you for your responses, your questions, and your engagement. On behalf of the Voices from the Periphery, we hope this conversation will stay with us, all of us, long after we leave this space. Until next time, take care. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us.
Ayush, may I just say thank you all so much. Those were some really wonderful questions. I so deeply appreciate this engagement. Thank you for hosting me. And I would love to see all of the questions, if it's possible to send them to me. I think they will stimulate my own thinking. And I invite anybody who wants to get in touch with me to please do so.
খানাটা সব
Thank you so
শেষ।
much.
আমরা আবার কিনে আনবো।
Yes, ma'am. I will send you those questions by email.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.